very much, Ilka, and greetings to all of you here in Vienna. It is a great pleasure and privilege on behalf of ADEPT and the ADEPT Network to be with you here in Vienna, and we take the opportunity to thank Michael and VIDC and Alexi and Radio Africa for the cooperation and the warm welcome. The assumption we make in running our countries and running our lives is that there will be progression. The story of humankind is the story of solving problems for progression. So this is the normative framework. Now, crises and difficulties are supposed to be exceptions that we deal with, but the trajectory is one of progression. We try through complex mechanisms, through international organizations, and through conventions and laws to cement and guarantee some of the fundamental rights and privileges of being a human being. We've heard from Anna examples of such conventions, and in her lovely phrase, the bits that are crisis resistant and the ones that are not. We've heard about the humanitarian protections, the refugee protections. Within the same framework, there are also proactive conventions, agreements on socio-economic development frameworks. And in recent years, there are ones that link migration and development as a nexus of positivity and progression rather than one of crisis. The whole world in general have agreed this as well. Just to mention in more recent agreements on that would be the 2013 United Nations High-Level Dialogue on Migration and Development, when the UN Secretary General issued an 8.5-year plan. Last weekend, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, although everyone is not very happy with the wording in this new framework, but there is, without any doubt, positive linkages and recognition of migration as a force for development. So, how then do we bring in the issue of crisis and deal with it without fundamentally altering that natural progression that is to evolve, to develop, and to do better for ourselves and our families? I think we need to then understand a little bit about the nature of crisis, perhaps to help us formulate new ways of dealing with them when they arise. Within the migration crisis, the two most topical ones, I think, in Europe at least, are of course the Syrian crisis and the Mediterranean, the South Mediterranean Sahara crisis. You would see in your programs that in the opening session we expected a gentleman from the African Union to be with us. Unfortunately, he is in Turin and couldn't make it. He would have mentioned to us that there would be in November an EU-Africa summit in Valletta, Malta on migration. That is to reflect and also to continue discussions and action on the southern Mediterranean Saharan migration crisis. Nevertheless, I am asked to look at what are the types of crises that impede or jeopardize or endanger that natural progression of humankind. In my observation, the typology is three in nature. There are the crises, three types of crises which would impede development. Those are the ones that distract us from our strategic goals, the ones that cause a reversal of progress we've achieved, and the ones that make us set up new retrogressive ambitions. That last one is actually quite scary, but we need to discuss it. Within Europe and within countries that have refugees, you find that in some cases there is a very progressive and positive approach that governments use. Yet with crisis and its different forms, you come to a time when communities, governments are changing their mind and are stepping backwards, almost as if they are receding from civilization. I'll give you an example. As we speak, in the United Kingdom, the government is discussing passing a law that would make it a criminal offense for a landlord to rent out a house to an irregular migrant. That, to me, is a step backwards from civilization, because it goes beyond the issue of managing migration, which governments have a right to do, but the act of creating someone to be destitute, that the act of having shelter becomes a criminal act, I think is an example of the type of crisis that leads to retrogression. That is a sort of extreme example. Most of the effects of crisis are they cause a distraction or they cause a reversal. Very few times do they cause major retrogression. In this case, with the two crises, migration crisis we're talking about, I think both things are happening. There is distraction and there is some element of reversal. Now, how come we are in this situation? Why are we distracted? And it bothers me because for European governments in the EU, these are relatively well-run countries with lots of resources and capability. How come the inflow of 300,000, 400,000 people within the EU suddenly causes an absolute collapse and pandemonium all about, when Lebanon, over half of the population, over a quarter of the population are refugees? When we have seen, people have told us, towns and settlements where the refugees now outnumber the local community. When Turkey, whose economy is 3.5 times smaller than the one of the United Kingdom, yet it has spent $6 billion on the Syrian refugees, and in the United Kingdom, we are proud of our 1 billion spending. That 1 billion, we are indeed proud of it because it's more than all the amount of all the other European countries put together. That is on money. Of course, another example is, how come in the UK we consider it a crisis because few hundred people are trying to cross the English Channel to come in, when in Jordan they've got millions and very little money in comparison with the United Kingdom. So I think it's about how we come as nation states, as government. It's about how we come to recognize what a crisis is. And here, I want to challenge government, I want to challenge civil society to look at it again, because it was not always this bad. Not very long ago, in living memory, we were a bit more resilient in how we managed our nations. So let's look at how come a crisis come to be. In my view, again, there's 4 elements to it. There are the active factors or the causative factors. There is the lack of reactive response or the lack of response to reactive response. Then there's the element of perception, and then there's the element of short-termism. And I'll explain that a little bit. One, taking the migration crisis, the active element is when you have major inflow of people. That's one part, that's the starting point. But that's not the only reason, because when we have big events happening in some countries, like if you're hosting the World Cup, there's Because lots of people coming, it's not a crisis. So the very fact that many people are coming, it's not a crisis. So the other element to it is, who are these people coming? If there are people who are hoping to stay with you for a while or for longer, that affects whether you see it as a crisis or not. If maybe they are not, in Europe, they are not white Christians, it affects how you view it, whether it's a crisis or not. But the two main elements to the active part of a crisis is high number of people coming, and they are a sort of people you are not terribly sure about. Second element is the reactive part. The reactive part is, do you have the capability, the capacity, the structure, and the organization to receive them? If I'm hosting a World Cup, I have the capability through my airports and my staff to receive lots of people coming. I have the capacity in that we've built new hotels to receive them. I have the structure and the organization for it to work. The reactive element is, we have seen in the Turkey example, from virtually no resident refugee population to an explosion in the million, they have developed, not perfect, but a degree of capability, capacity, some structure and organization. That's the reactive part. So if you were a country and you have all of that, you will not have a crisis, because they come, you deal with it, no crisis. Third element, perception. Now let's say you've got the active part, let's then say you don't have the reactive part, but still there needs to be a mental element to perceive it. And that mental element, I would challenge the audience to say, it's not automatic, it is partly manufactured. Because the fact that these things are happening, how does that translate to perception? The migrants or the refugee coming, I've not seen them because they're somewhere far away from me. Some of the government ministers and policymakers acting have never seen them. So how is it? So that tells us that the perception goes through a process. And my observation of the process, the key elements to the process are the following. One, the mass media and their communication and editorialization of what we receive. That's one element. Second is the view of extremists, people who are interested in this particular group. Interest, and I call them extremists on both sides. Either that they should not be here, or let's open our doors, everyone come in. But there is those extremists rather than the normal view. They have a very big impact on setting the perceptive element. The third part of what forms that is when it comes to public opinion. So from the media input to the activities of extremists to the formation of public opinion, which then scares the politicians who react, as it were, to the policy. So looking at these three core elements, the fourth part is the short-termism. Crisis by nature should be short-term. Otherwise, we should always call it a chronic crisis, because a crisis should be short-term by nature. When it persists, we should qualify it and say it's a chronic crisis, and it betrays the incompetence of whoever's running it. If you were human and you have a disease, which is a crisis, if it's chronic, the chances are you will die out of it. So as nation states, if we're not able to deal with crisis and it's chronic, it goes to the very heart of our governance and our polity. Now, how then, given this as the situation, how is it that we should be reacting so that not every flow of groups of people is considered a crisis, and how do we react? I mentioned earlier that 50 years ago, 40 years ago, we have a greater degree of resilience, because here in Europe, we were in a Cold War situation. We thought that the West and the East would get into nuclear Armageddon. And in countries, we had nowadays, when we say strategic planning, we're thinking of business. 40 years ago, strategic planning was about resilience. So we had systems, we had resources, we have plans of what would happen if there was nuclear war. And we planned for it because we thought that was the biggest crisis that would affect us. In the world we're living now, sudden movements of people, climate change, pandemic outbreaks are the things that will happen. And we should use the power of the state and the resources and the ingenuity of the people to do a strategic planning to be able to deal with these things. We have seen Germany, as the most powerful country in Europe, have decided to take a greater number of people. If we go by the sort of managerial and strategic sort of excellence or ability or competence that Germany have shown before, my sense is they would be able to manage it because they would develop capacity, capability, organization to handle it. And my last comment is, how can we make that into a positive thing so that this story ends up being a positive narrative rather than just crisis fighting? For this conference, VIDC and the Huffington Post have published an article I'd written on the matter called Opportunities Amidst a Migration Crisis. And one of the comments I made is that the plight of the refugee is one of desperation and destitution, but the person of the refugee is neither helpless nor hopeless. My guess is Germany, I say it now, and maybe Germans would not like it. All of Europe, we have a demographic deficit. The European Union tells every nation to plan for it, and we're not. My sense is Germany and other smart countries would take this so-called crisis and manage it and transform it into a positive narrative to contribute to some of the strategic challenges we would face in 15, 20 years' time. And I think we should have a narrative from civil society, from government, that offers that approach as an alternative to just the short-term crisis management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Faal, that you gave us this whole picture, also this relationship of the what does a crisis means and what kind of opportunities from a crisis can also develop. I think we solved that in the last weeks in different European cities, also in Vienna. You know, what we called as a refugee crisis. On the one hand, we saw what does it mean, a crisis, but on the other hand, we saw also this civil society involvement. But still, I think they are just, we have to debate that, how we can build here structures in order, what we call as a civil society, it can have a grant, it can have an infrastructure, and it can have a basis. And for that, what I take from your talk is, on the one hand, we cannot leave civil society such as a civil society, but still the talks, the dialogues with the governments in order to build governance mechanisms is an important condition. But on the other hand, also the questions of public opinion, how we can have as a civil society influence on the public opinion is the second question which we can maybe discuss further.